A young boy's heart skipped a beat when he saw her push the man over the edge. What happened next would leave anyone speechless. The sun was setting low over the riverbank in Sacramento, California, casting a golden glow on the calm waters below. It was one of those evenings where everything seemed far too tranquil to ever be disturbed. On the old stone bridge, a favorite spot for locals seeking quiet reflection, stood two figures, their silhouettes stark against the horizon. One of them, Elliot Harmon, a man in his 70s, leaned against the railing. His tailored jacket and polished shoes spoke of wealth, but his slightly hunched posture hinted at his advancing age. Elliot was well known in the community, a man who had earned a reputation for his philanthropy by funding schools and shelters. Yet behind this polished exterior, whispers followed him, rumors of arrogance, a sharp tongue, and a tendency to remind people of the favors he had done for them. Standing beside him was a woman in her early 40s with auburn hair neatly tied at the nape of her neck. Her name was Lorraine, one of Elliot's trusted confidants, or so he believed. She wore a polite smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes, nodding along to his words. To anyone observing from a distance, they might have appeared like old friends engaged in conversation. However, beneath the surface, tension simmered. Elliot's voice, calm at first, began to grow sharper as he gestured animatedly. "You think I don't know what's been going on, Lorraine? You can't keep these things hidden forever." His tone carried an edge that made Lorraine tighten her grip on the strap of her handbag. Tilting her head slightly, her voice dripped with forced patience as she replied, "You've always been so paranoid, Elliot. Maybe it's your age catching up with you." Below them, the river flowed quietly, its calm surface betraying no sign of the storm brewing above. Birds chirped in the fading daylight, the last sounds of an otherwise peaceful evening. Nature itself seemed oblivious to the growing unease on the bridge. What neither Elliot nor Lorraine realized was that someone else was nearby, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Hidden among the tall reeds by the riverbank, a 9-year-old boy named Theo sat perched on a rock, tossing pebbles into the water. He often came here after school, escaping into his own little world of imagination. But today was different. Theo's gaze wandered to the figures on the bridge. Something about the way they stood and the sharp tones of their voices made his stomach churn uneasily. Lorraine's polite smile faltered, replaced by a hardened expression. Elliot, too focused on his own words, didn't notice the shift in her demeanor. "You think I won't do something about it?" he said, his voice dropping but still biting. "I've dealt with people like you before." Theo couldn't make out every word, but the rising tension was clear. He tucked himself deeper behind the reeds, his heart pounding. He didn't know what was about to happen, but he sensed it wouldn't be good. Suddenly, the conversation on the bridge took a darker turn. Elliot stepped closer to Lorraine, his voice harsh and accusatory. "You've used me, haven't you? All the trust, all the opportunities I gave you, it's all just been a game to you." Lorraine's grip on her handbag tightened, her knuckles white. Her voice turned cold and distant as she replied, "You don't understand. You think your money makes you untouchable, that it gives you control over people. But you're just an old man who can't see what's right in front of him." Elliot's eyes narrowed, and he let out a bitter laugh. "And what's that supposed to mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she glanced over the edge of the bridge, her expression resolute. Sensing something was off, Elliot softened his tone, perhaps realizing he was on dangerous ground. "Lorraine, whatever you think you're doing." But he never got to finish. In one sudden, impulsive motion, Lorraine shoved him with both hands. Elliot's startled cry was brief as his body tipped over the railing and plunged into the cold, rushing water below. The sound of his impact was muted, swallowed by the river's current. For a moment, Lorraine froze, her hands still outstretched as if unable to comprehend what she had just done. The pounding of her heartbeat filled her ears, drowning out all other sounds. She stood motionless, staring at the water, but Elliot didn't resurface. Her chest heaved as panic threatened to overtake her. Then, glancing behind her at the empty pathway, she realized no one else was around. No one had seen. With trembling fingers, she smoothed the front of her coat and adjusted the strap of her handbag. Taking a shaky breath, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the stone bridge as though nothing had happened. But Lorraine had miscalculated. Down by the riverbank, hidden behind the reeds, Theo had seen everything. His breath caught in his throat, and he clamped a hand over his mouth to stifle a gasp. His young mind raced, trying to process the scene he had just witnessed. Elliot's body briefly reappeared in the water, his arms flailing weakly against the current. He wasn't moving toward the shore. He wasn't moving at all. Theo's first instinct was to run. He was just a kid. This wasn't his responsibility, but something rooted him to the spot. Perhaps it was the thought of his own grandfather who had taken him fishing at this very river. Or maybe it was the faint, desperate sound of Elliot's struggles. Whatever it was, Theo knew he couldn't just walk away. His heart pounding, he stepped out from the reeds, his small hands trembling. He glanced up at the bridge, half expecting to see the woman staring back at him. But she was gone. The pathway was empty, except for the fading figure of Elliot struggling in the water. "Hey!" Theo shouted, his voice breaking with fear and urgency. "Hey, can you hear me?" Elliot barely turned his head, his strength ebbing as the current carried him farther from the bridge. Theo's chest tightened. The man wasn't going to make it on his own. Kicking off his sneakers, Theo waded into the river, the icy water biting at his legs. It was colder than he had imagined, and his breath hitched with every step. "Hold on," he yelled, trying to keep his voice steady, even as fear coursed through him. The river, however, showed no mercy. Elliot's head slipped below the water's surface, and a wave of panic surged through Theo's chest. He stumbled back onto the riverbank, his eyes darting frantically in search of anything that could help. A few feet away, his gaze locked onto a thick branch wedged against a boulder. Scrambling toward it, he grunted as he wrestled it free. The wood was heavier than he anticipated, but it felt strong and sturdy. Dragging it to the water's edge, he sank his feet into the mud and shouted, "Grab this," as he extended the branch into the river as far as he could reach. Elliot's hand broke the surface, weakly flailing in the air, but his fingers missed the branch. Theo stepped deeper into the icy water, the current pressing hard against his small frame. The cold seeped into his bones, but he pushed forward. "Come on," he yelled, his voice cracking with urgency. Finally, Elliot's trembling fingers caught hold of the branch. For a terrifying moment, his grip slipped, and Theo's heart sank. "No, don't let go," Theo cried, summoning every ounce of his strength. This time, Elliot held on, his knuckles whitening against the dark wood. Planting his feet into the muddy riverbank, Theo pulled with everything he had. The current resisted, tugging them both further into the river, but Theo refused to let go. His muscles burned, his legs quivered, but inch by inch, he managed to drag Elliot closer to the shore. Almost there, Theo panted, his voice filled with determination. Elliot's body scraped against the rocks as Theo hauled him onto the bank. When the boy finally collapsed beside him, both were gasping for air. Elliot's face was pale, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. Theo stared at him, unsure of what to do next, until the faint sound of sirens broke the silence. The noise grew louder with each passing moment, and relief swept over Theo. Someone must have heard his cries for help. Still, Theo wasn't finished. Kneeling beside Elliot, he shook the man's shoulder and pleaded, "Stay awake. They're almost here." Elliot's eyes fluttered open, his breath ragged and his lips a chilling shade of blue. Barely above a whisper, he asked, "Who are you?" "Theo." The boy replied quickly, his teeth chattering. "I saw what happened. You're going to be okay. Help is on the way." The sirens were deafening now, echoing through the trees. But Elliot's body was trembling violently, and Theo worried he might not hold on until help arrived. Gripping Elliot's hand, Theo urged, "Don't go to sleep. Stay awake, you hear me?" Elliot blinked sluggishly, his head lolling to the side. Panic gripped Theo as he feared the worst. Jumping to his feet, he ran to the edge of the road, his soaked socks caked with mud. Waving his arms frantically, he shouted as a police car screeched to a halt. "Over here," he yelled, his voice cracking. Two officers stepped out, followed by paramedics with a stretcher. Theo led them to the riverbank, his words tumbling out in a rush. "He fell. No. He was pushed into the river. I pulled him out, but he's really cold, and I think he hit his head." The paramedics quickly wrapped Elliot in a thermal blanket and began checking his vitals. One of the officers turned to Theo, his expression a mix of concern and astonishment. You pulled him out of the river by yourself. Theo nodded, still catching his breath. I didn't know what else to do. The officer crouched to meet Theo's gaze. That was incredibly brave, son. You probably saved his life. Theo glanced at Elliot, now being loaded onto the stretcher. For the first time, a flicker of pride warmed his chest, but the weight of what he had seen still lingered. Tugging on the officer's sleeve, Theo said, the woman, the one who was with him, she pushed him. I saw it. The officer's face hardened. Are you sure? Theo nodded, his heart pounding. I saw her do it. Then she just walked away. After exchanging a glance with his partner, the officer pulled out a notepad. Can you describe her? Anything you remember will help. Theo hesitated, his mind racing back to the bridge. He described her auburn hair, her coat, and the calm way she had walked away. The officer wrote it all down, his jaw tightening. As the ambulance disappeared down the road, Theo couldn't shake the fear that the woman might escape before they caught her. The hours that followed were a blur. The police took Theo's statement, and paramedics checked him for hypothermia. Wrapped in a scratchy blanket and sipping hot cocoa, Theo replayed the events in his mind, the push, the rescue, and everything in between. Elliot was stabilized at the hospital, though he would need time to recover. When Theo's mother arrived, panicked and tearful after hearing from the police, she hugged him tightly. What you did was incredible, she whispered. You're so brave. The story made headlines the next day. 9-year-old saves wealthy philanthropist from near death flashed across screens, accompanied by a photo of Theo, still soaked and shivering. Strangers and neighbors alike praised him, but Theo wasn't focused on the attention. His thoughts kept circling back to the woman. Had the police found her? 2 days later, an officer knocked on their door. Theo and his mother opened it together, their hearts pounding. The officer smiled faintly. We got her, he said simply. You found her? Theo asked, his voice trembling. The officer nodded. Your description was spot on. We tracked her to a nearby hotel. She was trying to leave town when we caught her. Relief swept over Theo, followed quickly by anger. Why did she do it? He asked. The officer sighed. We're still figuring it out. She worked for Mr. Harmon for years, but there were financial disputes. She claims he was going to ruin her, and she acted out of desperation. It'll all come out in court. Theo's small hands curled into fists. She just left him there, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The officer placed a hand on his shoulder. And you didn't. You stayed. You saved him. Don't forget that. The trial brought closure. When Theo testified, his steady voice recounted the harrowing events. The courtroom was silent except for the gasp that rippled when he described how the woman had walked away. Elliot, sitting in a wheelchair, gave Theo a small nod of gratitude as he finished. Lorraine was convicted, and as she was led out in handcuffs, Theo watched her blank, unreadable expression. For the first time since that night, he felt a sense of closure. Life slowly returned to normal, though Theo had changed. The mayor awarded him for his bravery, and Elliot, now fully recovered, publicly praised the boy who saved his life. He even created a scholarship in Theo's name. Sitting by the river one evening, Theo reflected on everything. He realized that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about acting despite the fear. And sometimes, the smallest of moments make the biggest difference.